In 1923, 17 children vanished from the Stonelake Institute for Wayward Youth in Charleston, South Carolina. Their disappearances officially recorded as voluntary departures. The red brick buildings of the Stonelake Institute still stand today on Magnolia Street, their Gothic windows boarded shut, their iron gates rusted permanently closed. Local residents avoid the property, claiming the very ground feels wrong beneath their feet. But it wasn't supernatural forces that made this place a house of horrors. It was the calculated cruelty of those entrusted with the care of society's most vulnerable children. What happened within those walls between 1919 and 1932 represents one of the most systematic and deliberately concealed cases of institutional abuse in American history. The evidence, buried for decades in courthouse basements and forgotten filing cabinets, tells a story that officials at every level of government worked desperately to suppress. The institution's reputation. The Stonelake Institute for Wayward Youth opened its doors on October 15, 1919, with considerable fanfare and the blessing of Charleston's most prominent citizens. The institution was the brainchild of Dr. Edmund Whitmore, a Harvard-educated psychiatrist who had gained national recognition for his progressive theories on juvenile rehabilitation. Whitmore believed that troublesome children could be reformed through a combination of strict discipline, manual labor, and what he termed corrective behavioral modification. The timing of the Institute's founding was no coincidence. The aftermath of World War I had left America grappling with unprecedented social problems. Cities were overcrowded, unemployment was rising, and juvenile delinquency rates had skyrocketed. Traditional orphanages and reform schools were overwhelmed, creating a desperate need for new solutions. Dr. Whitmore positioned himself as the answer to these societal concerns, promising to transform incorrigible youth into productive citizens. The Institute's board of directors read like a who's who of Charleston society. Chairman Harrison Caldwell owned the largest textile mill in the region and had direct ties to the state legislature. Vice Chairman Margaret Sinclair was the widow of a prominent judge and controlled substantial inherited wealth. Other board members included banker Theodore Ashworth, newspaper publisher James Rutledge, and Reverend Samuel Morrison, whose congregation included the city's most influential families. From the beginning, the Stonelake Institute cultivated an image of progressive reform. The facility's promotional materials emphasized its modern scientific approaches and individualized treatment programs. Dr. Whitmore frequently spoke at medical conferences, publishing papers with titles like The Psychological Roots of Juvenile Deviance and Industrial Training as Character Building. His work was praised in national publications, and the Institute began receiving referrals from across the Southeast. The physical plant itself was impressive by the standards of the era. The main building was a three-story brick structure designed in the Gothic Revival style, with tall arched windows and decorative stonework. Adjacent buildings housed workshops, dormitories, and administrative offices. The grounds covered 43 acres and included vegetable gardens, livestock pens, and a small factory where children manufactured textiles for local businesses. Public tours were conducted monthly, allowing potential donors and curious citizens to observe the Institute's operations. Visitors were shown model dormitories with neat rows of beds, classrooms where children received basic education, and workshops where they learned useful trades. The children encountered during these tours were invariably clean, well-behaved, and eager to demonstrate their reformed attitudes. Local newspaper coverage was universally positive, with headlines like Stonelake Institute, a beacon of hope for troubled youth, and Dr. Whitmore's revolutionary methods show remarkable results. The Institute's reputation was further enhanced by its apparent success in placing graduates in productive employment. Regular reports detailed how former residents had secured jobs in textile mills, domestic service, and agricultural work. Letters from grateful parents and employers were published in the Institute's annual reports, praising the transformation of children who had previously been considered hopeless cases. Financial support flowed generously from both public and private sources. The state legislature provided substantial annual appropriations, viewing the institute as a cost-effective solution to the problem of juvenile delinquency. Private donations came from wealthy individuals who saw supporting the institute as both a civic duty and a sound investment in social order. The Charleston Chamber of Commerce regularly highlighted the institute as an example of the city's progressive leadership. Dr. Whitmore himself became something of a celebrity in professional circles. He was invited to address the National Conference of Charities and Correction, served on committees for the American Medical Association, and was offered consulting positions with similar institutions in other states. His personal life appeared equally exemplary. He was married to the daughter of a prominent minister, lived in a fashionable neighborhood, and was active in charitable organizations. The Institute's educational program was particularly praised by contemporary observers. Unlike traditional reform schools that focused primarily on punishment, Stonelake emphasized academic instruction alongside vocational training. Children attended classes in reading, writing, arithmetic, and basic sciences. The curriculum was designed to prepare them for productive integration into society upon their release. The vocational training component was equally impressive on paper. Boys learned carpentry, metalworking, and agricultural techniques. Girls were taught sewing, cooking, and domestic skills. The Institute's workshops produced goods that were sold commercially, with profits supposedly used to fund additional programs. This self-sustaining model was viewed as innovative and economically sound. Religious instruction was another cornerstone of the Institute's approach. Daily chapel services were mandatory, and prominent local ministers regularly visited to conduct special programs. The Institute's philosophy emphasized moral rehabilitation through spiritual guidance, appealing to the religious sensibilities of the era. Parents were assured that their children would receive not just behavioral correction, but also proper Christian education. The admission process appeared thorough and professional. Children were referred by juvenile courts, family services agencies, and occasionally by desperate parents who had exhausted other options. Each applicant underwent extensive evaluation, including medical examinations, psychological assessments, and interviews with family members. The Institute claimed to accept only those children who showed genuine potential for rehabilitation. Staff credentials were impressive by the standards of the time. In addition to Dr. Whitmore, the Institute employed several college-educated administrators, certified teachers, and skilled craftsmen who supervised the vocational programs. The relatively high staff-to-student ratio was frequently cited as evidence of the Institute's commitment to individualized attention. The Institute's relationship with local law enforcement was particularly close. Police officers regularly consulted with Dr. Whitmore on matters involving juvenile offenders, and the Institute served as an alternative to the overcrowded county juvenile detention facility. This partnership was viewed as progressive, representing a shift from purely punitive approaches to more rehabilitative methods. The facility's medical program was another source of pride. Dr. Whitmore had equipped the Institute with what he claimed was the most advanced medical facility in the region for treating troubled youth. The medical wing included examination rooms, a small surgical suite, and laboratory facilities. Parents were assured that their children would receive the best possible medical care while addressing their behavioral problems. The Institute also pioneered what were described as innovative therapeutic techniques. Dr. Whitmore claimed to have developed new methods for treating the psychological disorders that he believed caused juvenile delinquency. These methods, which he described in vague terms in his published papers, were said to combine the latest advances in psychology with practical behavioral modification. Local government officials were particularly supportive of the Institute's mission. The mayor of Charleston served as an honorary board member, and the city council passed several resolutions praising the Institute's work. State legislators regularly visited the facility and cited it as an example of progressive social policy. The Institute's annual reports were distributed to government officials across the Southeast as a model for similar programs. The Institute's success was measured not just in the rehabilitation of individual children, but in its broader impact on the community. Local crime rates among juveniles reportedly decreased after the institute opened, and city officials credited Dr. Whitmore's work with making Charleston a safer place for families. The institute was seen as proof that scientific approaches to social problems could produce measurable results. Professional recognition continued to accumulate for Dr. Whitmore and his team. Medical journals published his research, university professors cited his work in their lectures, and government agencies consulted with him on policy matters. The institute became a destination for professionals from around the country who wanted to observe its innovative methods firsthand. The children who graduated from the institute were held up as success stories that validated the entire approach. Regular follow-up reports tracked their progress in employment and social adjustment, consistently showing positive outcomes. These success stories were featured prominently in fundraising materials and used to encourage other communities to establish similar institutions. By 1921, the Stonelake Institute housed approximately 180 children, ranging in age from 8 to 17. The waiting list for admission was substantial, with applications coming from across the region. The institute's success seemed undeniable, its methods appeared scientifically sound, and its leadership was beyond reproach. It had become a model that other communities sought to emulate. However, beneath this carefully constructed facade of progressive reform and scientific advancement, a far different reality was taking shape. The very features that made the institute appear so impressive, its isolation, its authority over vulnerable children, and its freedom from meaningful oversight, were creating conditions that would enable systematic abuse on an unprecedented scale. The stage was set for one of the most horrific chapters in American institutional history, one that would remain hidden for decades through a combination of official indifference, deliberate cover-up, and the simple fact that the victims were children whom society had already decided to forget. Ignored signs. The first indication that something was seriously wrong at the Stonelake Institute came in the form of a letter dated March 15, 1921, addressed to the Charleston Police Department. The letter, written in a child's careful script, was signed only with the initials M.R. and contained disturbing allegations about conditions inside the facility. "They hurt us every day," the letter read. "Dr. Whitmore has a room in the basement where he takes the children who don't behave. Some of them don't come back. Please help us. We are afraid." The letter was filed away without investigation. The desk sergeant who received it, Officer Robert Coleman, later claimed he assumed it was a prank or the fantasy of a troubled child. This response was typical of the era's attitude toward children's complaints against adult authority, particularly in institutional settings. Similar letters began appearing with increasing frequency over the next 18 months. Some were addressed to local newspapers, others to government officials, and a few to parents who had placed their children at the institute. The content varied, but common themes emerged: references to brutal punishments, inadequate food, children who disappeared without explanation, and mysterious activities in the institute's basement levels. The Charleston Evening Post received at least 6 such letters between 1921 and 1922. Editor James Rutledge, who also served on the Institute's board of directors, instructed his staff to discard them immediately. Years later, a former reporter named Carl Bennett would recall being specifically told that troublemakers at the Institute were trying to cause problems for Dr. Whitmore's good work. Parents who received letters from their children faced a difficult dilemma. The letters described conditions that seemed impossible to reconcile with the Institute's sterling reputation. Most parents chose to believe the official explanations they received when they inquired about their children's welfare. Institute staff consistently attributed such letters to attention-seeking behavior or difficulty adjusting to necessary discipline. Mrs. Dorothy Hughes, whose 13-year-old son Walter had been placed at the Institute in 1921, received 3 letters from him describing what he called the punishment room and begging to be taken home. When she contacted Dr. Whitmore about these letters, he assured her that Walter was experiencing typical adjustment difficulties and that the letters were part of a pattern of manipulative behavior. He suggested that responding to such letters would only encourage Walter's problems. The first official complaint was filed with the South Carolina Department of Public Welfare in June 1922. The complaint came from Thomas Lambert, a former institute employee who had worked as a night security guard for 3 months before quitting abruptly. Lambert reported witnessing cruel and unusual punishments and claimed that children were being subjected to experiments in the basement laboratory. The department's response was swift and decisive. They forwarded Lambert's complaint directly to Dr. Whitmore for his response. Whitmore's written reply dismissed Lambert as a disgruntled former employee with a history of alcohol abuse who had been terminated for unreliability and inappropriate behavior toward the children. The department accepted this explanation without further investigation. Lambert's attempts to take his story to local newspapers were equally unsuccessful. He approached the Charleston Evening Post, the News and Courier, and 2 smaller weekly papers. None would publish his account. Years later, Lambert would tell investigators that he had been warned by unnamed parties that pursuing his allegations would result in serious consequences for him and his family. The pattern of ignored warnings continued throughout 1922 and 1923. A delivery driver named Eugene Hoffman reported seeing children in the institute's yard who appeared malnourished and bore visible injuries. A postal worker named Ralph Daniels claimed that outgoing mail from the institute was being screened and that many letters were confiscated before being sent. A local minister named Reverend Lawrence Harper expressed concerns about the institute's religious program. After noting that children seemed frightened during chapel services, each complaint was either dismissed outright or explained away by institute officials. The common thread in all responses was the assertion that outsiders simply didn't understand the difficult nature of working with troubled children. Dr. Whitmore and his staff positioned themselves as dedicated professionals dealing with society's most challenging cases, and critics were characterized as either uninformed or malicious. The most serious early warning came from Dr. Francis Lowe, a physician who had been called to the institute in August 1922 to treat a child who had allegedly fallen down a flight of stairs. Dr. Lowe later reported that the child's injuries were inconsistent with a fall and appeared to have been inflicted deliberately. She also noted that other children in the infirmary showed signs of malnutrition and what appeared to be systematic physical abuse. Dr. Lowe's report to the county medical examiner was met with skepticism. The examiner, Dr. Charles Baker, was a personal friend of Dr. Whitmore and had financial investments in several businesses that received contracts from the institute. He concluded that Dr. Lowe had misinterpreted the evidence and that the children's conditions were consistent with the natural consequences of their previous neglect and troubled backgrounds. The financial relationships that connected institute leadership to local officials created a web of conflicts of interest that effectively prevented meaningful oversight. Board Chairman Harrison Caldwell's textile business received lucrative contracts to purchase goods manufactured by the children's labor. Banker Theodore Ashworth's institution held the institute's accounts and had made substantial loans for facility improvements. Newspaper publisher James Rutledge's papers received regular advertising revenue from businesses connected to the institute. These financial entanglements were not secret, but they were not widely understood by the general public. The institute's supporters portrayed these relationships as evidence of the community's commitment to the facility's success. Critics who pointed out potential conflicts of interest were dismissed as troublemakers who didn't understand legitimate business practices. The children's families, meanwhile, faced enormous barriers to obtaining information about their loved ones. Visiting policies were restrictive, with most families allowed only one supervised visit per month. During these visits, children were closely monitored by staff members, making private communication impossible. Letters from children were censored, and parents were told that this was necessary to prevent negative influences from undermining the rehabilitation process. Several parents attempted to remove their children from the institute after receiving disturbing letters or reports. They discovered that the legal framework governing the facility made this extremely difficult. Children who had been committed by juvenile courts could not be released without court approval. The judges who had originally committed these children were reluctant to second-guess their decisions, particularly when presented with official reports describing the children's continued need for institutional care. The few parents who succeeded in removing their children from the institute found that their children had been dramatically changed by the experience. Many were reluctant to discuss what had happened to them, displaying what would later be recognized as symptoms of severe trauma. Some exhibited behavioral problems that had not existed before their placement at the institute. Others showed signs of physical abuse that parents had difficulty getting medical professionals to document. Margaret Wells, who managed to remove her daughter Alice from the institute in late 1922, later described the reunion as heartbreaking. "My daughter was like a ghost," she recalled. "She hardly spoke, and when she did, it was in whispers. She was terrified of being alone and would wake up screaming from nightmares. When I asked her what had happened, she would only say that she couldn't tell me because they would know." The pattern of ignored warnings reached a crescendo in early 1923 when 3 separate incidents occurred within a 2-week period. First, a group of children attempted to escape from the institute, with 2 of them reaching the Charleston city limits before being apprehended. The children claimed they were fleeing from terrible things happening at the facility, but police returned them without investigating their claims. Second, a fire broke out in one of the institute's basement areas, requiring the response of the Charleston Fire Department. Firefighters reported finding what appeared to be a medical laboratory with unusual equipment and locked cells, but their questions were dismissed by Dr. Whitmore as misunderstandings about the facility's modern therapeutic apparatus. Third, a child named Harold Price was found dead in his dormitory bed, officially attributed to a weak heart. However, the funeral home director, Arthur Newman, privately expressed concerns about the condition of the body to several community members. Newman noted injuries that seemed inconsistent with natural death, but his concerns were never formally investigated. These incidents, occurring so close together, might have triggered a comprehensive investigation under different circumstances. However, the web of relationships and financial interests that surrounded the institute proved too strong. Each incident was explained away, dismissed, or forgotten. The children who had attempted to escape were subjected to additional corrective measures that further discouraged others from trying to flee. The institute's isolation worked in favor of those seeking to maintain secrecy. Located several miles outside Charleston proper, the facility was surrounded by rural farmland and had limited contact with the outside world. Deliveries were made by trusted contractors, and visitors were strictly controlled. This isolation made it difficult for outsiders to observe conditions inside the facility and easy for administrators to control the flow of information. Staff turnover at the institute was remarkably low, which administrators cited as evidence of job satisfaction and institutional stability. However, later investigations would reveal that this stability was maintained through a combination of generous compensation, intimidation, and careful selection of personnel who were unlikely to question authority or report problems. The few staff members who did express concerns about conditions at the institute found themselves quickly marginalized or dismissed. A teacher named Evelyn Clark was terminated in 1923 after questioning the educational policies that kept children confined to dormitories for days at a time. A kitchen worker named Lillian Hammond was fired after commenting on the poor quality and insufficient quantity of food being served to the children. These dismissed employees found it difficult to find new employment in Charleston, as word of their troublemaking spread through the tight-knit professional community. The message was clear. Questioning the institute's operations was a career-ending mistake. This created a culture of silence among staff members that effectively prevented internal oversight. The institute's medical program, which had been a source of pride in its early days, became increasingly secretive as time went on. Dr. Whitmore restricted access to the medical wing, claiming that the sensitive nature of the treatments required privacy and concentration. Parents were told that their children were receiving cutting-edge therapies that were too complex for lay people to understand. The monthly public tours, which had been a regular feature during the Institute's early years, became less frequent and more carefully choreographed. Visitors were shown only specific areas of the facility and were accompanied by staff members who ensured that no unauthorized conversations took place with the children. The children who were selected to interact with visitors were clearly chosen for their compliance and apparent well-being. Local law enforcement officials maintained their close relationship with the Institute, but this relationship increasingly served to protect the facility from scrutiny rather than to ensure proper oversight. Police officers who received complaints about the Institute were instructed to refer them directly to Dr. Whitmore, rather than conducting independent investigations. This arrangement was justified as a way of avoiding unnecessary disruption to the Institute's important work. The state legislature continued to provide funding for the Institute without conducting meaningful oversight. Annual budget hearings were perfunctory affairs where Dr. Whitmore presented glowing reports of the facility's success without being challenged on specific details. Legislators were more interested in the positive publicity associated with supporting progressive social programs than in examining how public funds were actually being used. The medical establishment's support for Dr. Whitmore remained strong throughout this period. Professional colleagues continued to cite his work and invite him to speak at conferences. The fact that no formal complaints had been filed with medical licensing boards was taken as evidence that his methods were sound and ethical. The medical community's tendency to close ranks around one of its own made it difficult for critics to gain credibility. Religious leaders in Charleston maintained their endorsement of the Institute's mission, viewing it as an important part of the community's charitable work. The Institute's emphasis on Christian education and moral rehabilitation appealed to religious sensibilities, and ministers regularly encouraged their congregations to support the facility financially. This religious endorsement provided additional legitimacy and made criticism seem almost sacrilegious. The business community's support for the Institute was motivated by both financial and social considerations. The facility provided a market for local goods and services, and its success was seen as evidence of Charleston's progressive leadership. Business leaders who served on the Institute's board used their positions to enhance their own reputations while benefiting financially from their connections to the facility. The press coverage of the Institute remained uniformly positive throughout this period. Newspapers regularly published stories about the Institute's successes and Dr. Whitmore's innovations, but they showed no interest in investigating the complaints and concerns that were beginning to surface. The close personal and financial relationships between newspaper publishers and Institute leadership made critical coverage virtually impossible. The children trapped within the Institute's walls began to understand that their appeals for help were not only futile but dangerous. Those who continued to write letters or speak out during visits were subjected to increasingly severe punishments. A culture of terror developed within the facility, where children learned that survival depended on complete silence and submission. The most vulnerable children, those with no family connections or whose families had abandoned them, became the primary targets for the worst abuse. Dr. Whitmore and his staff understood that these children could disappear without anyone asking questions. The official records would show them as runaways or transfers to other facilities, and no one would investigate further. The bureaucratic systems that were supposed to protect children instead became tools for enabling abuse. Court-ordered commitments made it nearly impossible for children to leave the Institute, even when they begged family members to help them escape. The legal framework that had been designed to ensure appropriate treatment instead created a prison from which there was no escape. By mid-1923, the Stonelake Institute had perfected a system of operation that was virtually immune to outside scrutiny. Complaints were routinely dismissed, critics were discredited, and the institution's reputation remained intact. The stage was set for the most horrific period in the facility's history, when the warnings that had been ignored for years would prove to have been tragically accurate. The children trapped within the Institute's walls would soon discover that their attempts to seek help from the outside world had not only failed, but had made their situation considerably worse. The very people who should have protected them had instead protected their abusers, creating a situation where the most vulnerable members of society were completely at the mercy of those who would exploit them. Horror uncovered. The truth about what happened inside the Stonelake Institute began to emerge in the most unlikely way possible, through the meticulous record-keeping of the perpetrators themselves. Dr. Edmund Whitmore, perhaps driven by scientific hubris or a desire to document his research, maintained detailed files on every child who passed through the institution. These records, discovered decades later in a forgotten storage room, would provide the most damning evidence of systematic abuse ever documented in an American institution. The breakthrough came in 1954, 22 years after the institute's closure, when the building was being demolished to make way for a shopping center. Construction workers breaking through a basement wall discovered a hidden room containing filing cabinets, medical equipment, and dozens of manila folders marked with children's names and case numbers. The foreman, Samuel Warren, initially assumed these were routine medical records. A closer examination revealed documents that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The files contained detailed descriptions of what Dr. Whitmore called behavioral modification experiments. Children were subjected to procedures that had no basis in legitimate medical practice and were designed purely to test the limits of human endurance and psychological manipulation. The records showed that these experiments were not random acts of cruelty, but systematic studies with carefully documented results. One file, labeled Subject 47 Male, age 12, described a series of sensory deprivation experiments conducted over a 6-month period. The child was confined in a soundproof cell in complete darkness for increasingly long periods, with Dr. Whitmore recording the psychological effects of isolation on developing minds. The final entry in this file, dated March 15, 1923, noted that the subject had ceased responding to stimuli and was no longer suitable for further study. Another file documented temperature experiments where children were subjected to extreme cold and heat to test their physical resilience. The records showed that these tests were conducted in the Institute's basement laboratory, which had been equipped with specialized chambers designed to maintain precise environmental conditions. Several children died during these experiments, their deaths attributed in official records to natural causes or pre-existing conditions. The most disturbing files dealt with what Dr. Whitmore termed psychological breaking points. Children were subjected to systematic psychological torture designed to completely destroy their sense of identity and self-worth. The techniques included prolonged isolation, constant verbal abuse, sexual assault, and forced participation in acts of violence against other children. The records show that Dr. Whitmore was particularly interested in documenting how long it took to completely break a child's spirit. Among the recovered documents was a letter from Dr. Whitmore to a colleague at a medical school in Philadelphia, dated September 1924. In this letter, Whitmore described his work at the Institute as groundbreaking research into the malleable nature of the human psyche. He expressed particular pride in his ability to remake children according to his specifications, boasting that he could transform any child into a completely compliant subject within 6 months. The files also contained photographs, hundreds of them, documenting the physical effects of the experiments. These images showed children in various stages of malnutrition, physical abuse, and psychological breakdown. Many of the photographs appeared to have been taken for purely documentary purposes, with clinical notations describing the subject's conditions. The coldly scientific nature of these images made them even more disturbing than they would have been as mere evidence of abuse. When Samuel Warren contacted the Charleston Police Department about his discovery, he was initially met with skepticism. The officers who responded to his call were unprepared for what they found. Detective Harold Baldwin, who had been with the department for 15 years, later described the scene as unlike anything I had ever encountered in my career. The systematic nature of the abuse, the detailed documentation, and the sheer number of victims made it clear that this was not a case of isolated incidents, but a comprehensive program of institutionalized torture. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of the horror that had occurred at the Stonelake Institute. Between 1919 and 1932, approximately 340 children had been processed through the facility. Of these, 89 had died while in custody, a mortality rate of over 25%. The official cause of death in most cases was listed as natural causes, accidents, or pre-existing conditions, but the recovered records told a different story. The files revealed that Dr. Whitmore had divided the children into different categories based on their perceived usefulness for his experiments. Children who were deemed promising subjects were subjected to the most intensive abuse, while those considered unsuitable were often killed within weeks of their arrival. The records showed that Dr. Whitmore had developed specific criteria for selecting victims, focusing on children who had no family connections or whose families were unlikely to inquire about their welfare. One of the most shocking discoveries was a series of audio recordings made by Dr. Whitmore during his experiments. These recordings, made on primitive wire recording equipment, captured the voices of children begging for mercy, screaming in pain, and eventually lapsing into complete silence. The recordings were apparently made for research purposes, as they included Dr. Whitmore's clinical commentary on the subject's responses to various stimuli. The investigation also uncovered evidence of a broader conspiracy involving several staff members and community leaders. Assistant Director Margaret Sinclair had been directly involved in selecting victims for Dr. Whitmore's experiments, using her position to identify children who would not be missed. Head of Security. Frank Reynolds had been responsible for disposing of bodies and maintaining the secrecy of the operation. Even some board members appeared to have been aware of the true nature of the Institute's activities. The most damning evidence came from the testimony of survivors who had managed to escape the Institute or who had been released before the most intensive period of abuse. These survivors, now adults, provided first-hand accounts of the horrors they had witnessed and experienced. Their testimonies, given during grand jury proceedings in 1955, painted a picture of an institution that had been transformed into a laboratory for human experimentation. Rose Jennings, who had been a resident of the Institute from 1922 to 1924, testified that she had been repeatedly raped by Dr. Whitmore and forced to participate in sexual acts with other children while he observed and took notes. She described being kept in solitary confinement for weeks at a time and being denied food and water as punishment for minor infractions. Most disturbing was her testimony about being forced to watch the torture and murder of other children as part of Dr. Whitmore's psychological experiments. Another survivor, Edward Collins, described the Institute's basement laboratory in detail. He testified that he had been subjected to medical procedures without anesthesia, including surgery performed by Dr. Whitmore for no apparent medical purpose. Collins described seeing children strapped to tables while Dr. Whitmore performed various experiments on their bodies, documenting their responses to pain and trauma. The survivor testimonies also revealed the systematic nature of the cover-up that had protected the Institute for so long. Children who attempted to report abuse were subjected to even more severe punishment, creating a climate of terror that prevented most victims from speaking out. The few who did manage to get word to the outside world found that their complaints were dismissed or ignored, reinforcing their sense of helplessness. The investigation revealed that Dr. Whitmore had been in correspondence with similar institutions across the country, sharing information about his experimental techniques and results. Letters were found indicating that he had been planning to publish his findings in medical journals, presenting the abuse as legitimate scientific research. The scope of his network suggested that the Stonelake Institute was part of a broader pattern of institutionalized abuse that may have occurred at other facilities. The discovery of the hidden files also revealed the fate of the 17 children who had officially been recorded as voluntary departures in 1923. These children had not left voluntarily, but had been murdered during a particularly intensive period of experimentation. Their bodies had been buried in unmarked graves on the Institute's property, and their families had been told that the children had run away and could not be located. The financial records found among the documents showed that Dr. Whitmore had been receiving payments from various sources for his research, including what appeared to be government agencies and private foundations. The exact nature of these funding sources was never fully determined, but the payments suggested that the experiments at the Stonelake Institute were part of a larger research program with connections to powerful interests. The most chilling aspect of the recovered documents was their clinical tone. Dr. Whitmore's notes read like legitimate scientific papers with careful attention to methodology, statistical analysis, and conclusions. The systematic nature of the abuse, the detailed documentation, and the apparent belief that this work constituted legitimate research made it clear that the perpetrators had not seen themselves as criminals, but as scientists pushing the boundaries of human knowledge. The investigation also revealed the elaborate security measures that had been put in place to protect the Institute's secrets. The basement laboratory was accessible only through hidden passages, and the existence of the experimental program was known only to a small group of staff members who had been carefully selected for their loyalty and discretion. The Institute had operated what amounted to a secret research facility hidden within a publicly funded institution. Medical examinations of the surviving victims revealed long-term physical and psychological damage, consistent with the abuse described in the files. Many survivors suffered from chronic health problems that could be traced directly to the experiments they had endured as children. The psychological trauma was even more severe, with most survivors displaying symptoms of what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. The scope of the abuse extended beyond the immediate victims to include the families who had been deceived about their children's fate. Parents who had believed their children were receiving help instead discovered that they had been subjected to torture and murder. The betrayal of trust was so complete that many families never recovered from the revelation of what had actually happened to their loved ones. The evidence revealed a level of planning and organization that suggested the abuse had been carefully orchestrated from the beginning. The Institute's reputation for progressive reform had been deliberately cultivated to provide cover for the experimental program. The emphasis on scientific research and innovative treatment methods had been used to justify procedures that had no legitimate medical basis. As the scope of the abuse became clear, investigators began to understand why the warnings and complaints had been so systematically ignored. The Institute had not simply been protected by incompetence or indifference, but by a deliberate conspiracy involving some of the most powerful figures in Charleston society. The very people who should have been protecting the children had instead been protecting their abusers. The evidence found in the hidden room represented only a fraction of what had actually occurred at the Stonelake Institute. Dr. Whitmore's meticulous record-keeping had documented the most significant experiments, but there was evidence of additional abuse that had not been formally recorded. The true scope of the horror would never be fully known, as many of the victims had been killed and their records destroyed. Legacy and silence. The investigation into the Stonelake Institute should have resulted in one of the most significant criminal prosecutions in American history. Instead, it became a textbook example of how institutional power can be used to suppress inconvenient truths and protect the guilty at the expense of justice for the victims. The first indication that the investigation would be compromised came within weeks of the discovery of the hidden files. Dr. Edmund Whitmore, who had been living quietly in retirement in Florida, died of an apparent heart attack just 3 days before he was scheduled to be questioned by investigators. His death was ruled natural, despite the suspicious timing and the fact that he had been in good health according to his personal physician. The deaths continued with disturbing regularity. Margaret Sinclair, the former assistant director, who had been directly implicated in the selection of victims, died in a car accident while driving to Charleston to meet with prosecutors. Frank Reynolds, the head of security who had been responsible for disposing of bodies, was found dead in his home from what appeared to be a self-inflicted gunshot wound. A suicide note was found, but handwriting experts later questioned its authenticity. By the time the grand jury convened in 1955, most of the key figures in the case were dead, and the surviving witnesses faced intense pressure to remain silent. Several survivors reported being visited by unidentified individuals who warned them against testifying. Others found that their employment was terminated, or that they faced harassment from community members who viewed them as troublemakers, attacking the reputations of respected citizens. The grand jury proceedings themselves were marked by irregularities that suggested deliberate obstruction. Key evidence disappeared from police custody, including several of the most damaging files and some of the audio recordings. Witnesses who had initially agreed to testify suddenly became unavailable, or claimed to have no memory of events they had previously described in detail. District Attorney Joseph Carter, who had initially promised a thorough investigation, began to express doubts about the strength of the case. He pointed out that most of the alleged crimes had occurred more than 20 years earlier, making prosecution difficult under the best of circumstances. He also noted that many of the supposed victims could not be located or identified, raising questions about whether the crimes had actually occurred. The local newspapers, which had once celebrated the Institute's reputation, now worked to minimize the significance of the revelations. The Charleston Evening Post ran a series of articles questioning the authenticity of the discovered documents, suggesting that they might have been fabricated by disgruntled former employees or troubled individuals seeking attention. The paper's publisher, James Rutledge, who had served on the Institute's board, argued that the allegations were an attempt to destroy the reputations of dead individuals who could no longer defend themselves. The medical establishment also closed ranks to protect Dr. Whitmore's reputation. The American Medical Association issued a statement expressing skepticism about the allegations and emphasizing that no formal ethics charges had ever been filed against Dr. Whitmore during his lifetime. Several prominent physicians wrote letters to newspapers defending Dr. Whitmore's contributions to the field of child psychology and suggesting that his work had been misunderstood by lay people. The legal system proved equally protective of the institution's reputation. Judge William Harris, who had been responsible for committing many children to the Institute, ruled that most of the evidence was inadmissible due to chain of custody problems and the passage of time. He also issued a gag order, preventing investigators from discussing the case with the media, effectively ending public scrutiny of the proceedings. The final blow to the investigation came when the building that had housed the Institute was demolished before a complete archaeological survey could be conducted. The bodies of the 17 children who had supposedly left voluntarily were never recovered, and the physical evidence of the basement laboratory was destroyed. Official records claimed that the demolition was necessary for safety reasons, but critics argued that it was a deliberate attempt to eliminate evidence. The grand jury ultimately issued a report that acknowledged irregularities in the operation of the Stonelake Institute, but concluded that there was insufficient evidence to warrant criminal charges. The report suggested that any abuse that had occurred was the result of misguided but well-intentioned efforts to help troubled children, rather than deliberate criminal conduct. The survivors of the Institute found themselves in an impossible position. Their testimonies had been discredited, their credibility attacked, and their attempts to seek justice thwarted at every turn. Many retreated into silence, traumatized not only by their original abuse, but by the system's refusal to acknowledge their suffering. Rose Jennings, who had been one of the most vocal survivors, eventually stopped speaking publicly about her experiences after her home was vandalized and her employer was pressured to fire her. She moved to another state and spent the rest of her life trying to forget what had happened to her. In a letter written shortly before her death in 1987, she expressed bitter disappointment that the truth had never been acknowledged. Edward Collins, another survivor, attempted to write a book about his experiences at the Institute, but was unable to find a publisher willing to risk the legal consequences of printing his account. He eventually self-published a limited edition that was quickly suppressed through legal threats from the estates of the accused perpetrators. The children who had died at the Institute were never properly memorialized. Their families were never officially notified of their deaths, and no compensation was ever provided to those who had suffered abuse. The Institute's records were sealed by court order, preventing researchers from studying what had happened or learning from the tragedy. The property where the institute had stood was eventually developed into a shopping center, as originally planned. No marker or memorial was ever erected to acknowledge what had occurred there. The only physical reminder of the institute's existence was a single brick from the original building, which was preserved by a local historical society without any explanation of its significance. The broader implications of the Stonelake case were equally disturbing. The investigation had revealed connections between the institute and other similar facilities across the country, suggesting that the abuse might have been part of a systematic program of human experimentation. However, these connections were never fully explored, and the other institutions were never investigated. The government agencies that had provided funding for Dr. Whitmore's research were never identified or held accountable. The private foundations that had supported the institute's work were never required to explain their involvement. The network of officials who had protected the institution from scrutiny faced no consequences for their actions. In the decades that followed, occasional attempts were made to revive interest in the Stonelake case. Investigative journalists would sometimes revisit the story, but their efforts were hampered by the sealed records and the reluctance of officials to cooperate. Academic researchers who tried to study the case found that key documents had been destroyed or were permanently classified. The institutional mechanisms that had enabled the abuse at Stonelake remained largely unchanged. Child welfare agencies continued to operate with minimal oversight. Institutional abuse cases were still handled with the same secrecy and deference to authority, and the voices of victims were still routinely dismissed as unreliable or motivated by ulterior purposes. Federal agencies that might have investigated the broader implications of the case showed no interest in pursuing the matter. The connections between the Stonelake Institute and other research programs were classified as matters of national security, effectively preventing any meaningful investigation. The culture of secrecy that had protected the institute during its operation continued to protect the broader network of which it had been a part. The medical and psychological professions made minimal changes in response to the revelations about the institute. Professional ethics codes were updated with language about informed consent and patient welfare, but these changes were largely cosmetic. The fundamental belief that professionals should be trusted to police themselves remained unchanged, and meaningful external oversight was still seen as unnecessary interference. Legal reforms that might have prevented similar abuses were never implemented. The courts continued to defer to institutional authority in matters involving children, and the burden of proof remained so high that successful prosecutions of institutional abuse were virtually impossible. The legal system that had failed the children of Stonelake continued to fail subsequent generations of victims. The families of the victims were left to struggle with their grief and anger without any official recognition of their loss. Some families never learned the truth about what had happened to their children, continuing to believe the official explanations they had been given decades earlier. Others discovered the truth through unofficial channels, but found no avenue for seeking justice or compensation. The psychological damage inflicted on the survivors extended far beyond their childhood experiences at the institute. The subsequent denial and cover-up had created additional trauma that many never overcame. The message that their suffering didn't matter and that those who had abused them were more important than their victims became a defining reality that shaped the rest of their lives. The last known survivor of the Stonelake Institute died in 2003, taking with her the final first-hand account of what had occurred there. By that time, the story had been largely forgotten by the general public, relegated to the status of local legend rather than documented historical fact. The case files, what remained of them, were eventually transferred to the South Carolina State Archives, where they remain under seal. Researchers who have attempted to gain access to these files have been told that they contain information that could compromise national security, though the nature of this supposed security risk has never been explained. The Stonelake Institute represents more than just a case of institutional abuse. It represents a failure of the entire system designed to protect society's most vulnerable members. The children who died there were failed not just by their abusers, but by the police who ignored their pleas for help. the officials who covered up the crimes, the media that suppressed the truth, and the legal system that denied them justice. The silence that surrounds the Stonelake case to this day is perhaps the most damning aspect of the entire tragedy. The refusal to acknowledge what happened, to hold anyone accountable, or to learn from the mistakes that allowed such abuse to occur, represents a continuation of the original crime. Every day that passes without recognition of the truth is another day of injustice for the children who died there. The few surviving documents from the case paint a picture of systematic abuse that was enabled by institutional indifference and protected by official corruption. The fact that similar cases have continued to emerge at other institutions across the country suggests that the lessons of Stonelake were never learned because they were never acknowledged. The culture of deference to authority that enabled the abuse at Stonelake persists in modified forms today. Institutions to be given the benefit of the doubt when allegations of abuse emerge, victims are still required to meet impossibly high standards of proof, and those in positions of power to protect each other at the expense of those they are supposed to serve. The network of financial and professional relationships that protected the Stonelake Institute can be seen in similar forms around other institutions today. The same mechanisms that prevented oversight and accountability in 1920s Charleston to operate in different contexts, protecting new generations of abusers and ensuring that their victims remain voiceless. Today, the site where the Stonelake Institute once stood is indistinguishable from any other commercial development. Shoppers walk across ground where children once suffered and died, unaware of the history beneath their feet. The silence is complete, the secret preserved and the truth buried as effectively as the bodies that were never found. The legacy of the Stonelake Institute is not just the children who died there, but the system that failed them and continues to fail others. Until the truth is acknowledged and justice is served, the victims will never truly rest, and society will never truly heal from the wounds inflicted by those who were supposed to protect its most vulnerable members. The story of Stonelake serves as a reminder that evil flourishes not just through the actions of those who commit it, but through the silence and complicity of those who choose to look away. The children who died there deserved better from the adults who were supposed to protect them, and their memory deserves better from the society that has chosen to forget them. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way we can see how far these stories are reaching. And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering.